Alright guys, chapter 11 here, and we're continuing discussing this third British Empire. What was its nature and how was it made up, and what was it trying to do differently than before. The third British Empire we talked about kind of starting about 1931, going to about 1976, and we're diving deeper in the discussion. Chapter 10, we talked about this from some certain angles, but the questions here that we talk about here in chapter 11 help us dive into it a little differently, as well as a lot of the other things that were beginning to go on within the empire or in around the world. A lot of fascinating discussions. Some of the terminology here we're going to be talking about is new terms like the Commonwealth, describing the empire, or concepts of decolonization, as Britain was beginning to lose hold on its grasp of different colonies, diving into things like that. We'll see the advent of new organizations and institutions like NATO, things like that will be discussed in the middle of all this chapter. But I wanted to start off with the aspect of, also a huge highlight to the discussion in this chapter is also why Britain became more and more indebted to the United States, financially, and how that all tied into the United States rising up in prominence as well. Then just talking about the Third British Empire phase, the first question really kind of dived into that we studied question 1. To highlight some of those things, but also wanted to mention certain specific events like the Statute of Westminster. This happened in 1931, the beginning of this little phase that we're talking about here. This is a very important statute, as basically the statute waived jurisdiction over its dominions. So within the empire, the dominions were represented by like those big countries that we think of, like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Newfoundland. These were dominions, so they were part of the British Empire. Still all that historical colonial development and so forth, but they are such prominence in their own right, and have gained such autonomy in many ways that this statute of 1931, the Statute of Westminster, waived jurisdiction from Great Britain over them. So it really loosened again their hold on these dominions specifically. So it's very key to point that out and note in the middle of all this, where we see the Third British Empire making overtures within its its empire and its structures to colonies, etc. But we also see part of it is some concessions, even kind of loosening up some of their hold on dominion. So take note of that one too. Also, strategic, as I mentioned in the beginning here, is new terminology, kind of repackaging, instead of the word empire, using a word called Commonwealth. This really is linked to that British Nationality Act of 1948, where it was saying, hey, anybody a part of this Commonwealth can be considered citizens, of Great Britain. Basically what it's advocating, but it introduced this new terminology of Commonwealth, and that's important. You have heard that, I'm sure, many times in our contemporary setting. We will still hear of the Commonwealth being referred to. Lots of times we even see it in sports. You have the Commonwealth Games. It's like a miniature Olympics, but within what the former British Empire had relationally, colonies and so forth. They'll come together and do their Commonwealth Games. We see Commonwealth relationships a lot in other sports situations like cricket. We have India playing against South Africa or playing against Australia and New Zealand, and you'll see these relationships still going on within the Commonwealth nations. So it's a key term that came about at this time, where both, again, the Westminster Statute 1931 loosened grips on dominions, but then a little bit down the road in 1948, in overtures of trying to keep things intact relationally, the British Nationality Act made everybody, part of the empire, or now this Commonwealth, have citizen status. So I really want to point those out and make sure you caught on to some of those. And and I may just now pivot right to our first question that we studied together, we answered together. Reading the question title, it was, in what ways was a third British Empire developed in the period after 1931 and on, right? And this empire represented basically a new form of imperialism, right? It's not trying to give up imperialism. It's not really trying to go back towards a liberal political economy. It's furthering in this social democratic kind of structure, and within that, it's trying to keep holds our relationships, if you will, within its colonies, and certain colonies very, very direct hold on still, like some of the colonies in Africa, for example, and early on some of the colonies like India, things of these areas were still trying to very much be held on, while it's also making overtures, like you already talked about, to dominions, of kind of loosening some of their hold on it, but yet in a relational tactic. And there's three concepts that the author really points to when it comes to some of the characteristics, again, of the social democratic strategy here, of the Third British Empire, where it's trying to stem anti-colonial movements that are continuing to resurrect, especially in the 1930s. We saw some of that being put on hold during World War I, and then a resurgence of nationalistic and anti-colonial movements, around the empire. So these strategies, economically, politically, culturally, were strategies that we can see in this Third British Empire, trying to hold things together. So from the economic standpoint, we see it trying to again foster trade within the empire, focusing on that sterling area, where it defined an area of relationships, so that everybody had a common currency, and it fostered this British nationality, even with that common currency. Politically, it held conventions to represent kind of representation and confer autonomy, or at least a measured amount of autonomy, to certain groups, while also trying to kind of communicate that it's trying to help people. We see these economic development plans, or these colonial development plans, which were overtures to say, hey, everybody can have welfare now, or we're trying to develop your colony, so stay in touch with us, stay connected with us, see the big picture of becoming part of the British Empire and all the promises that it is still making, even with what we already mentioned about the Commonwealth of Nations. We also see, from a cultural standpoint, I thought this was really interesting to learn in this chapter about British culture, where there was an active campaign of expanding Britishness to its colonies and even its new mandates. Here we see, after World War I, Great Britain being assigned a mandate over the Palestinian area, for example. Well, the author pointed out here the British Empire Service, for example, which is a precursor to the BBC that we're also aware of, where it tried to disseminate Britishness, whether it be music, lectures, just the English language as well. And this would have been done to foster both things. One, keeping the morale up and the connectedness to white settlers. Their British subjects maybe moved to the area, or that were basically managing the area, especially we see that like in Africa. So it'd keep them connected to their British roots and the British culture. It also then had hoped to communicate to those colonists, the subjects of the colonies, kind of awareness of how cool the British culture is, with its sophistication and civilization and all the things of a high society, that he would try to broadcast, to maybe have some of those then reach up to and become a part of, and esteemed to be a part of this great British experience. So those are three things that I'd really want you to point out, and they were pretty clearly talked about by the author directly, as well as we talk about the constructs of this Third British Empire. That also then ties into some of the discussion related to how the British Empire at this time also became very connected to the United States, and then also related to other key words and aspects of this time frame, like the Cold War and what that meant. It was interesting how the Cold War, which, and again, stopping on that just for a second, Cold War meaning, jockeying for position and from an ideological standpoint, capitalism versus communism, basically. But Cold War means there's not any violent fighting, there's not any physical altercation, but there's these chess piece moves, relationship building, fostering relationships in Europe. So, for example, the United States is its main goal, probably, you could say, in summary, for the Marshall Plan, which poured billions of dollars, 13, 14 billions of dollars into the reconstruction of Europe. Of course, there's a lot of altruistic humanitarian help in that, and goals in that sense too, is helping reconstruct Europe, England being a part of that as well, receiving funds. But also from a strategy standpoint, in a Cold War strategy standpoint, the United States would have been very keen on investing this way to also push back and or keep from infiltrating anyway the spread of communism. So it was very much a Cold War tactic as well. And as we see, and we'll probably just dive into that here in just a second too, question number 2, it really then relates to this intertwined relationship that deepened between Great Britain and the United States during this time. And again, hot war, I guess, would mean what? When tension escalated to actually become some military interaction or military conflict. We saw that later, of course, in like North Korea, South Korea, when this Cold War that was going on erupted to a hot war. We saw that later in Vietnam as well. Some of these Cold War tactics gave way to actually some hot war military activity. Let's go to question number 2 here. Let me turn to that. Question number 2 is diving into the great indebtedness that Britain became so engrossed in, with the United States. If the question reads, at what point and in what ways did Britain become dependent upon the United States of America? So it's in what ways as well. A lot of times we think of indebtedness, we think the financial side, which is obviously a key aspect to this discussion, but also in other ways as well. What I would want you guys to catch here is that really Great Britain began being indebted to the United States during World War II. We saw that it reached out across the pond to the United States even before the United States was even involved in World War II, asking for loans, asking for money, asking for help. So it even really started there. And as we had already talked about, England got, pummeled, during World War II. So it was really hurting in a lot of ways. And now, beginning to recover after World War II, it continued to seek loans directly from the United States. But key to that then, within the United States goals, United States of America's goals, and especially to stem the tide of communism and even spread capitalism, any time that Great Britain asked for loans or additional loans, the United States quickly included in the deal that Great Britain would go along with and partner with the United States in its Cold War campaign and Cold War efforts, even supplying troops as necessary and when necessary if things escalated to a hot war status. Specifically, what I wrote was that this indebtedness largely began in World War II, and as the Marshall Plan poured money in, and in England also Great Britain directly asking the United States for further loans, and it made them that much more connected. But we also saw then these new institutions come to life during this era. The United Nations, for example, kind of this policing force, if you will. We see the invention of this International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And now all of these were seated now where? In New York. New York, the United States of America. So we also are seeing this transfer of superpower status to the United States becoming, the superpower of the world, where not too long before that, England had been. So now we see this indebtedness financially, but we're starting to see now Great Britain's dependence on the United States, even in its weight around the world, and kind of shadowing it, going along with them and partnering with them as almost like a big brother, little brother thing now happening, and their involvement in these institutions together, but always now the United States taking the lead role. I talked about, again, that just ties into this whole intertwined dependence, on foreign policy. And even at times it would create situations where the United States then would even give Great Britain security militarily in certain regions of the world as well. So you have this back and forth situation where now the United States was even protecting Great Britain in certain areas, as well as this relationship continued to be furthered and intertwined. Some of the other things I mentioned that I really want you guys to connect with. In addition to the large military bases that the United States established, even in foreign, not foreign, but former Great Britain held areas and then throughout Europe, I really wanted you guys to pay attention to the Suez Crisis of 1956, the Suez Canal Crisis of 1956. The Suez Canal had originally been, and for quite some time, been controlled by Great Britain. And it was very much a lifeline for Great Britain. It was a very strategic hold, because it represented, the flow of trade, and in such a vital part of the world. Well, what happened basically in 1956, with all the pressures that Great Britain was under financially and getting spread so thin in so many ways, they eventually made the decision in 1956 to relinquish control of the Suez Canal. And why this is so important is it represented a real loss of this lifeline, number one. Second of all, it really marks a definitive line of where Great Britain lost prestige on the world stage, especially, first string on the field, so to speak. It definitely would become second string. Very often at some of the first string meetings said on the UN, United Nations Council and those kind of things. However, its prestige, 1956, really took a second seat then when it lost that hold on that. Also, in that kind of time frame too, it lost some great holds on the Middle East area where a lot of the oil comes from too. It even pointed that out too. So Great Britain is really hurting this time, becoming more and more indebted financially, more and more indebted when it comes to foreign policy, and dependent on the United States even in the foreign policy. It loses its hold in 1956 on the Suez Canal, additional holds in the oil-rich areas where the world just blossoming in its dependence on fossil fuels. And right at that time, England is great. It keeps saying England. Great Britain is losing hold on those things as well. So I'm hoping you're catching those things, and I really wanted to highlight that Suez Canal crisis as well. So study that a little bit more deeper in your reading, and it's key also to reflecting, actually that time again, like I said, where Great Britain really has begun to lose its prestige as a number one first string player in the world. Moving back to, I want to go back now to talking more about other key things that happened associated with this post-World War II era and the Cold War era. We mentioned, the Marshall Plan, for example, and it was great USA to rebuild Europe, basically. We see the terminology in the United States, and this is important as it reflects on Great Britain in those ways, but the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine basically just is saying that the United States is appointing itself as the advocate and poster child, for capitalism and for the free world. And it's taken on that perspective in a very assertive way around the world. And its duty is to protect, other countries from anything other than that, especially protect it from communism. So the Truman Doctrine was a post World War II foreign policy, concept, and again ties into things we're talking about, especially as the Cold War was really democracy, capitalism versus communism, in summary. And then the Third British Empire, still having these social democratic overtures within its empire, if you will, and it's within its commonwealth. But how this all becoming connected. Also wanted to point out some other things that came on the scene here as those Allied powers that had been victorious in World War II, Great Britain, France, Russia, United States especially, right? And what they did with some of the German previous German country and occupied areas. And it really set the stage for what we see more contemporary to our era, or even just before our immediate era here, especially, for myself as a teenager in the 1980s with Ronald Reagan, and I can still see him today, at the Berlin Wall saying, hey, tear down this wall. And that Berlin Wall was constructed during this Cold War era following World War II. So let's give a little more backdrop to that, okay? The German country and it's, and Austria included, all this was divided up into 4 zones. And with Russia, and you'll see I've put a link here in the lesson plan to kind of get a visual of some of these things. But it divided up into 4 zones with the 4 Allied powers that had been victorious ruling over these zones. Not ruling is the right word or not, but basically where you have Russia, taking most of Eastern Germany, and then you have France and Canada and the United States. I just said those wrong. Sorry, that was United States, Britain, and France, not Canada. That's another subject in a second. United States, Britain, and France, and then Russia, having these 4 zones, and you'll see that on that map. Where I'm going with this is then in Berlin, which is a city that was surrounded by the eastern part of Germany that Russia now was overseeing. Within Berlin, it was also divided into these zones. And so within Berlin became this wall that was built, and to separate the communist side, the Russian side, from the Western side. Even we see the formation of the Western German Republic, which represented those areas, other than what was controlled by the United States. So very fascinating time and how those things came to being, and it maybe even help, reflect on kind of why you see today some of the things that are related to this era. Pretty fascinating. In addition to that, we see the formation of the National Atlantic Treaty Organization, otherwise known famously as NATO. This is basically another policing organization that was to basically be ready to mobilize and fight against the spread of communism. It really came about when in an emergency situation where people need to be evacuated out of Berlin, which took over about a year's time, being evacuated from the eastern side of Berlin, where the wall was going up and things like that, where people need to be evacuated out of that area, and it lasted over about a year. Well, tied to all that is the formation of NATO, which was Canada, Britain, and the United States. Initially as the main ones. There were other ones. There was other, 10, 12 other countries involved. It wasn't just them, but they were like the 3 main powers at the seat of NATO here. And again, it's a political organization, but a foreign policy organization and a policing organization, all ready to combat, the spread of communism. So I really wanted to point NATO out as well. Another thing that was really interesting is going and pivoting to how the British Empire began to kind of fall apart. We're going to get into the whole decolonization question that we studied in just a moment too. But one thing I also wanted to insert that I thought was pretty fascinating. You remember when we talked about how the sterling area was created, and part of that again was to create a common currency among all those countries and colonies, and even closely tied other countries to have a common currency. And that could be used strategically at times to devalue it as a whole, so that then it became also more competitive in the world trade markets, because it now could produce things cheaper, and then therefore it would foster trade. And so it could be a strategy that could be employed as everybody is involved, and that one common currency is used strategically to kind of benefit the empire, so to speak. Well, it's really interesting in 1967, okay, with the dominions already having more of control with the waiver of jurisdiction that we talked about that happened in 1931, but then with the growing sentiment of autonomy of their own, other anti-colonial movements, etc., we get all the way out to 1967. I'm pointing this out for a reason, is that when Great Britain wanted to devalue the sterling another time, an additional time, for its strategies it wanted to kind of roll out, it's very, very telling that this time the dominions did not want to go along with it, and did not go along with it. They wanted at this time just to break away and just have their own currency. This was a huge, huge blow. There's not a whole lot holding the empire together, the Third British Empire here. It's already quaking in a lot of ways, and we'll go back and talk about the decolonization here too. But I want to fast forward real quickly in my thoughts here about that sterling area where even it, as almost one of its last threads that's kind of holding anything together, also broke when the dominions didn't want to go along and comply with that anymore. Interesting note. So I wanted you to catch that. Moving then on to decolonization. The question was the decolonization of the British Empire peaceable and pragmatic? Doesn't take a lot to realize right away that you could say absolutely not. And some of the things that the author pointed out, I even liked, and even wrote down a quote from him. Basically, was saying that the decolonization was not like a cool humanitarian effort on behalf of Britain. It's not like they came up with this idea of a peaceable decolonization effort with any kind of humanitarian overtures or relational overtures. It was not that at all. Matter of fact, he points out on page 417 that it was really the pressure of nationalistic revolt that continued to and drove decolonization. So it was nothing that Britain wanted, bottom line, but it definitely was forced upon them, especially as they had become so weak economically and their prestige around the world. They're just really losing grip on a lot of things. But unfortunately, this decolonization at times also represented a lot of violence, and for ways sometimes we may not have thought of. Some of the decolonization of certain areas happened pretty fast. It points out to that, like in India and Pakistan, once the decolonization kind of got underway, it actually happened pretty fast. And even though there was a lot of violence related to this, it really wasn't because Great Britain was doing the violent acts. It actually represented more because of their void. And I definitely highlighted this some in my paragraph. Let me just kind of read some of what I had put forth in responding to this question, and get some details. Dive into further details after reading this. But basically, what I was pointing out here is a summary that the decolonization was neither peaceable or pragmatic. and was spurred by nationalistic revolt, as opposed to British overtures, like I already mentioned. In some of the colonial regions, Britain's hasty withdrawal led to civil unrest and bloody civil war. So it's really their departure that almost allowed these historical, ancient tensions to re-resurrect. So I go on to say in India, for example, communal rivalries that had been coexisting, relatively peaceful, under British rule and under the British regime, who at times were even offered by Great Britain more and more representation and things like that. So this could have pacified a lot of these ancient rivalries, as all of them are hoping to have more of a seat, in representation in this British ruling system and governance. Well, and all of a sudden, when they're gone, when the big overhanded brother's gone, it led to civil war very, very fast, and it was very bloody, and hundreds of thousands of people were affected. A lot of it here, as we talk about in the India situation, is the way that these arbitrary borders were drawn. Britain's on their way out, pulls out a napkin. Okay, maybe that's a little bit oversimplification, but conceptually, pulls out a napkin and here's your guys' new borders, without really considering what they just did to people. Because immediately, like the author points out, immediately, all of a sudden, you have just realized you are on the wrong side of a new line that has been drawn. People that typically would have associated differently or drawn borders very differently because of the religious background, etc., are all of a sudden, disenfranchised or on the other side of the wrong line, and now are a minority or vice versa, and it just erupted into mayhem, especially with clashes against Hindus and Muslims and things like that. I've had a chance to be in Kashmir, India, multiple times. It's been a little bit, but even going to Kashmir, India, was a very, very north part of India today. It's so hostile there. You have representations of all kinds of military and policing force, because it is such a time bomb of unrest still today. Because many of those people in that area identify more with Pakistan and Muslim rule. Some actually identify even more with China, and then others identify with India. When I was there, I arrived 2 weeks after what they called the U.S. Tourist Office had just been, I don't know if it was just blown up. I just remember seeing all the machine gun holes on the wall, but at any moment, that place could erupt, and it's known still today to be in a very, very hot spot. Well, this goes right back to this kind of time frame where a regime, the British regime, was just departing, and all of a sudden created national borders that really didn't make sense to anybody. And so we see, civil war areas, and other areas like that could represent Palestine. Same thing, where they were trying to keep down the tension between Arabs and the Zionist Jews, and were trying to make overtures and things like that. And all of a sudden, when Great Britain kind of washes their hands of the area and has to pull out, same thing happened there as well. Lots of violence erupted. Pointing to different kind of area, however, in Africa, where Britain, like in Kenya, for example, didn't want to let go. So let's consider India and Palestine as areas that they wanted to go ahead and let go of, and then pulled out. Well, you have other examples that persisted well into the 60s and into the 70s, where there are certain areas and colonies that Britain just didn't want to get rid of and didn't want to let go of. So Kenya is a really good example of that one, where they actually do represent Great Britain, violent suppression and just brutality, as they're still keep trying to subjugate those colonial subjects, but also protect the white colonists who had benefited greatly from the colony, benefited greatly from any colonial development. They're the ones who won in these white settlers. And so the white settlers even became the ones being attacked at times, as so the indigenous people had had enough. And so they just really created a lot of violent reaction for quite a while. And so those are key things to point to how the decolonization was, number one, not a British idea. They didn't want to lose these places. And two, that it was definitely not pragmatic and definitely not peaceable. There's not too many ideas of anything that was peaceable in any example. Another thing that I thought was really interesting to learn, going back to the kind of India area here, for example, is the Bengal famine of 1943. This just points to, again, what I would say a great failure of this concept of that being a part of the British Empire was a good thing. Even if the British Empire sometimes wasn't doing anything wrong to you per se, it sure wasn't really doing right for you. The Bengal famine of 1943 is a huge example of that. This is where 3 million people died of starvation. They died of starvation because of a very simple thing that was not accessible to them, and that was rice. Japan in 1943 moved into an area called Burma, which is today Myanmar, which is right bordered against India and Bangladesh and all that area. Anyway, through that in 1943, at that advent, then rice supply was cut off, and so dramatically and so suddenly and persisted that 3 million people died because of the loss of access to rice. I just think that was phenomenal. I'm really glad he put that in. The author put that in here because it just shows again the failure of the British imperialism, the failure of why is it benefit to be a part of this great empire, and when you have this many people under your watch, as British National Act said, citizens, I guess that was 1948, but still the concept that it was supposed to be helping develop these places that it's ruling over. I want you guys to remember that one. I want to point that one out, and that it was Japan that attacked Burma, affecting the rice supply. But how during World War II, Britain really didn't do anything about that. They could have done much about that to deal with that. I thought another thing that's interesting, side conversation within this whole movement of people in the British Empire, but yet still lots of complexity, is this discussion of these half castes, where you had different colored people from different parts of the colony, maybe working in the shipyards or maybe being a part of shipping crews that would land and be for a while quartered in some of these ports, Liverpool, whatever. But the point is the half caste. So as they married and intermarried, that their children were considered half caste and non-citizens, even though they were supposedly British subjects. And this is after the 1948. And we see even in the homeland itself, the discrimination that goes on between people coming and moving and trying to move as supposed citizens, trying to move to the homeland itself, and the discrimination of even situations like this of half caste as well. So being in this British citizen wasn't necessarily all that it's cracked up to be, or didn't really pound out in the way you probably would think it should. Back to then some of the borders I was talking about, like in India, Palestine. Look at the links that I've put here. I think you'll be fascinated by just seeing some of that. I think I'm pretty much wrapped up with that discussion there. I'm just kind of reviewing my notes on that too. Yeah, I think we nailed it in that sense too. Also, pay attention just to, if you have any questions about assignments, feel free to email me, reach out to me in Populi as we look at research topics and essays. Any questions along those lines, also reach out to me as well, and we'll be diving into chapter 12 here real soon as well.